Hey, so on this episode of Education, I want to talk a bit about the physical effects of binge eating disorder on the body. And this sort of ties into the previous video where I talked about the physical long-term effects of vomiting in bulimia. Um, Binge eating disorder, however, can be considered a separate entity to bulimia because, the general idea of binge eating disorder is that people will go through prolonged periods of starvation, and this can be, from one day to many days. And then, at the end of this period of starvation, they will then go on to compensate for the days that they haven't eaten by eating a lot of food. And when I say a lot, this can be, thousands of calories. I've seen people who have said that they've eaten a whole birthday cake as a sort of starter for their compensation. That was followed by like a whole bag of pasta. That's like 500 grams, and then just sweets, chocolate, and then they would then go on to starve themselves again. However, this also ties into bulimia because people who are bulimic, they may also binge eat and then vomit. The areas that I want to cover in this video are the effects that it has on your hormones, the effects that it has on your cardiovascular system, and just some other effects that it can have on your body. Okay, so the first thing that I want to cover is the effect that it has on your physical appearance. Now, binge eating disorder and bulimia, these are two eating disorders that they can deviate from the general idea of eating disorders. When people think of someone with an eating disorder, all they really see is a really thin person. However, people with bulimia or binge eating disorder, they can be, a normal weight or even overweight. And this is, why awareness around eating disorders needs to be upped in this area, because you don't have to look thin to have an eating disorder. And there are some people with the binge eating disorder that can actually be considered to be clinically obese. And not only does that, increase your weight, obviously from an external appearance, but it also increases risk factors for lots of other things. And this area is termed the metabolic syndrome. And this includes things like type 2 diabetes, insulin resistance, which sort of ties into type 2 diabetes, but not completely, high blood pressure, high cholesterol, elevated fat in the blood. And so I'm going to try and cover a few of these areas. The first thing that I want to cover is the risk of getting type 2 diabetes. So when you eat a lot of food, you've gone from a period of starvation to the fed state. And in this period of starvation, after you've eaten a meal, you start to metabolize glucose in your blood because you've got plenty of it. And then once you start to run out of the glucose in your blood, you then start to try to metabolize the stores to increase the glucose in your blood. And this is achieved through a decreased production of insulin and an increased production of a hormone called glucagon. And when this is done, the liver starts to break down a big molecule called glycogen. And what glycogen essentially is, it's a lot of glucose molecules all joined together, and it's branching, and the liver just starts to break bits of glucose off that so that it can go into the blood. And on top of that, you also stop performing things like lipogenesis, which is the generation of new fats, and also protein synthesis. And this sort of makes sense because if you're not eating, the body thinks, hold on, let's stop building new molecules and start breaking them down so that we can have the energy. And then when you go from a starved state to a fed state, you then take in a lot of new glucose. So what happens then? Well, the amount of glucagon in your blood goes down, insulin goes up. And what this does is it inhibits the breakdown of glycogen, previously done in the liver. I also previously didn't mention the liver's also got the capacity to generate new glucose molecules from things that weren't glucose, like amino acids, lactate, other intermediates of the metabolic cycle, and that's also inhibited when insulin goes up. And in converse to the previous state, you also start building new fats and synthesizing new proteins. So you've gone from a catabolic state, kata meaning breaking down, to an anabolic state, ana meaning building. So that's the general thing that happens. And if you eat a normal meal, the insulin spike is relatively mild, and your body can handle it. However, in binge eating disorder, this insulin spike can be massive, and what this can do over repeated iterations, through many years of abusing your body like this, you can sort of develop an insensitivity to insulin. And what this means is that when you eat a meal, the insulin spike may go up, but your body doesn't really react to it. So you become insulin resistant, which is one of the things that relates to the metabolic syndrome. And if you continue doing this, your pancreas says, okay, well, if you're not responding to this level of insulin, I'm just going to produce more. And for a time, that can work. If you produce more insulin, it can sort of compensate for the lack of sensitivity. However, if you can then continue this for longer, what then happens is your pancreas, the cells that produce the insulin, they start to fail. And the reasons behind this aren't terribly clear. Reading in the literature, there's lots of hypotheses and things, but what is known is that to get type 2 diabetes, you need to have a lack of insulin output in the end, plus or minus insulin resistance. And so what you then have is type 2 diabetes. And this is one of the prolonged effects of binge eating disorder. The next thing that I want to look at is in relation to the cholesterol molecules in your blood. And I've tried to draw out a thing here. Okay? So, when you eat a meal, the fat and the cholesterol, it all goes to the intestine, obviously. And then what then happens is then the passage of fat is different from the passage of all the other molecules like glucose and amino acids. And what then happens is the fat and cholesterol goes into molecules called chylomicrons. And what these essentially are just imagine a sphere of membrane, and inside that you've got your cholesterol, you've got your fats, and also surrounding in this molecule you've got little cholesterol molecules and a protein called apolipoprotein. This chylomicron then goes into the blood, and then what then happens is it goes to the tissues like that, and an enzyme called lipoprotein lipase, it essentially cleaves off a load of the fat molecules so that the fat can go directly to the tissues and also to the adipose tissues for storage. And then you're left with something called the chylomicron remnant. And these remnants contain a little bit of fat and also cholesterol. So the remaining chylomicron remnants, they go to the liver. Okay? And then what your liver produces some other things that are similar to chylomicrons, but they're a bit smaller. The main one being VLDL, which stands for very low density lipoprotein. And what a lipoprotein essentially is similar to a chylomicron. It's a membrane with a protein called the apolipoprotein in the membrane, and inside this sphere you've got cholesterol, but it's not. It's stored as cholesterol esters. It's just a different molecule, and also fat, triglycerides, and this results in a very low density lipoprotein. What then happens is, similar to the chylomicron, it goes via the tissues, where it offloads a load of the triglycerides or fats via the lipoprotein lipase, and then it turns into something called the intermediate density lipoprotein, and it's a bit more dense than the very low density lipoprotein because it's lost the fat. And then this can continue to go through the tissues and offload a bit more, but the majority of it goes back via the liver to offload the remaining fat via another lipase called hepatic lipase. And then what you're left with is the lipoprotein LDL, or low density lipoprotein. And this is essentially full of cholesterol. And this LDL is what is termed the bad cholesterol. And the reason for this is that it's prone to sticking in your blood vessels, and that's where you can start forming things like atherosclerosis, which is, the plaques in your blood vessels. And so this is a bad thing, which I'm going to talk to you about in a second. The other thing that your liver does is it produces a completely different lipoprotein called HDL, or high density lipoprotein. And what this essentially mediates is something called reverse cholesterol transport. And it mediates transport of cholesterol from your tissues and your adipose tissues, so like that, back to your liver. Okay? Whereas LDL mediates cholesterol transfer from the liver to the tissues. And you can sort of see why it's called the bad cholesterol, because it sort of hangs around in your blood. And whatever LDL is sort of, not left in your blood, it can go back to the liver, where it reabsorbs the cholesterol and it starts this cycle again. Okay?